Welcome to Biblical Viewpoints, a program brought to you by the Churches of Christ and dedicated to the restoration of New Testament Christianity. For over 30 years, it has been the intent of this program to uphold the Bible as the final authority in religious matters. You have heard man's viewpoints, but we invite you to open God's Word and join us as we search for the biblical viewpoint.
Drew, we're going to spend a little time in the book of Acts today looking at what Christianity is, particularly Acts chapter 17, those first 9 verses. It's interesting how much of the full picture of Christianity we can get from just this text. I want to read this real quick, and then we'll dive in a little bit on the discussion of it. It says, "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as his custom was, went in to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, 'This Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ.' And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. But the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, 'These who have turned the world upside down have come here too. Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus.' And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go." So Drew, in this, on Paul's second missionary journey here, we see him come to the city of Thessalonica, a Greek city, Greek culture steeped in this. There's a synagogue of the Jews. That's an interesting thing. He always went there first, and probably something for us to take from that, isn't there?
Yeah.
Find the people that believe in God already, and let's start there. We're a little bit closer to the finish line, if you will, in convincing them of the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So he goes into the synagogue, reasons for 3 Sabbaths from the Old Testament scriptures about things that they were awaiting, right? They were looking for this. And so you see a number of converts, some of them even up to the leading women of the city. That's an interesting thought right there. But the gospel has that ability. But it also, I'm mindful here of Matthew chapter 10, verses 34 through 39, when Jesus made it clear that the truth he brought, the mission he was on, wasn't going to make everybody get along. It was actually going to be quite the opposite, wasn't it?
Right.
And so in this, the charges that the mob brings against Paul and the others, we're going to see that Christianity is a disruption to the world, first and foremost. It is a direction for the people, okay? Lets them understand where they need to go in the dominion of the King, that is King Jesus. And so everybody's operating. That last one, we Westerners, especially Americans, have a real problem with the idea of dominion, right?
Yeah.
Nobody has dominion over me. Well, we might want to rethink that. Everybody is under the dominion of, in the spiritual realm, one or the other, right?
That's right.
And so what about this disruption?
Yes, let's go ahead and take a look at it. Disruption for the world. If you look at Acts chapter 17, let's look at one little bit again. This is Acts 17:6. They dragged Jason and the brethren before the authorities, and that's an interesting word if you look into it. This is a specific city official there in the city of Thessalonica, easy for you to say. And in 17:6, it says, they declared these men have upset the world or turned the world upside down, and they've come here too. They've come here also. And they attack Christianity, and they say this. Now, they say this as a slur. They say, Christianity has turned the world upside down. But what they intend as a slur is actually, it's got quite a bit of truth in it, doesn't it? You see, Christianity is quite counterculture. And that's one of the things that our world, in a lot of ways today, doesn't like to hear, if you're counterculture. Well, Christianity is, folks, and it's always been that way ever since the world's been created. Ever since the world's been created, God's had a way of doing things that disrupts stubborn, rebellious, wicked man as directed by Satan. And when we think about some of these other passages that talk about the world, in John 3:16 it says, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Not talking about the planet. And I know that the word there that could be used could refer to the planet, but you and I know this. You and I know that a speaker always means what he means by his use of the word. A lexical definition here only goes so far. If you were to pick up your favorite dictionary, favorite lexicon, if you had one, and you said, well, let's look up and see what this word world means. Well, you might get a couple of different definitions, but you've got to understand that the word always means what the speaker or the writer intends for it to mean. You know, somebody who says, oh, he put his foot in his mouth. You get a lexical definition for foot. You get a lexical definition for mouth. It only takes you so far. But the expression means something else. It means what the speaker or the writer intends for it to mean. When God says he loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, he says that in Jesus. And he's not talking about the planet. He's talking about the inhabitants. He's talking about the people. And when we think about this other passage where, incidentally, John again uses the word world, I'm looking at 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. John's going to tell us a little bit about the world and its influence and the way it goes and the way it takes us. And in 1 John 2, listen to this. This is 2:15 of 1 John. Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And it says in 2:16 of 1 John, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And then John reminds us that the world is passing away, and also its lusts, its form, its entire sphere. But the one who does the will of God lives forever. Here's the point. Now, 1 John 2 has just said, if anybody loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. He's talking about something different than what he's talking about in John 3:16, isn't he? In John 3:16, when God so loved the world, he's talking about the people. But here he's using the word world in a different sense altogether. He's talking about its influence. He's talking about its pull. He's talking about its direction. And so back to Acts chapter 17 in our minds for a moment. When these fellows drag out the saints, Jason and the other brethren, and they're hunting for Paul and Silas, and they drag them out and they say, these men have turned the world upside down. They're talking about the whole direction that the world goes. They're wrecking our system, they're saying. And folks, for whatever it's worth, though intended as a slur, Christianity's never been anything but. Christianity has always been a disruption to the world. Now, where was this found? Where was a point in human history that marks distinctively that Christianity just gutted the world of its power, its way, everything? Well, if we let the apostles do their say, we let them have their say, they mark it at the cross. This is Colossians chapter 2. Listen to this, Colossians chapter 2, beginning in 14. Paul talks about he's canceled out the certificate of debt, and it consisted of decrees against us, and it was hostile to us, and he's taken it out of the way. Listen to this. He's taken this decree, this certificate of debt, out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. The death of Jesus wasn't just the death of a boy. And though there were thousands along the Ignatian Way that were crucified, this one was different. So says the apostles. Something about this boy being nailed to a tree marked out something different. This says in verse 15, he had, by his cross, disarmed the rulers and the authorities. He made a public display of them, and he triumphed over them through him. God in Christ had triumphed over the way of the world, and it was disrupting. You can't open up the book of Acts and just start reading a couple of pages in Acts. And guess what they start doing? They start wrecking cities. They start wrecking economies. The commerce, everything's thrown off because what happens is about 12 young men, I'm imagining they're young, 12 young men, they go throughout the cities and they're converting the priests, Acts chapter 6. They're converting masses, thousands. They're coming in droves, 3,000 in Acts 2, 5,000 in Acts chapter 4 and 5. And then you get into Acts chapter 6 and you've got priests converting. In Acts chapter 8, you've got people like that had come up to Jerusalem to worship. They're converting. And then you get into Paul's missionary journeys after even Paul, this savage hater of Christianity, even he converts. And he's one of the leading ones in the synagogue. So he says in Philippians chapter 3. And so everybody's realizing something is happening. And later on in the book of Acts, Paul will say, this thing was not done in a corner. You know what's happening? The world is being turned upside down. Now, before we leave this point then, quick question for us. Are we being as, in a Christian way, of course, but are we being as disruptive to the world as the apostles were in the first century? Now listen to me, and listen to me carefully and closely. You are not under the responsibility that the apostles were. There is a grave difference, okay? Jesus had appointed these 12 men for a specific task, some of which you and I cannot duplicate. So let's not get under the false pretense that we're under the same amount of responsibility as the apostles. In some ways that's true, in some ways it's not. In some ways we're under the same responsibility, in some ways we're not. You and I don't have the power that they had. You and I don't have the same kind of situation where there were awaiting Jews in all of these synagogues, awaiting for the coming of the Messiah. It's not the exact same. We may see some similarities in our culture today, but still the question that we're raising here, are we being disruptive to the world? Folks, the world is strong. Its pull is strong. And you and I have to do our best to fight it, to be a good, positive influence. And maybe if somebody were watching our lives, they too would look at us. And though they may intend it in a derogatory way, they may say of you and they may say of me, those kind of people have turned the world upside down. So Paul, we called you Paul. Todd?
I'll take it.
Okay, that's not a...
I wish I were.
We see that it's a disruption to the world. Where does this take us next? It takes us to see that there's a direction that God gives people.
Right. And I think before we get to that, not only is it a disruption in the world, it has to be a disruption in my world.
That's exactly right.
Because in whatever ways, some of us, like myself, I was way off in the world. Others, like yourself, you didn't veer as far off as I did, but you veered off. That's why you needed the blood. Everybody that's tuned in right now needs the blood of Jesus. Some have had whatever worldly things we're talking about. Their world has been disrupted enough where they said, and it's going to break one of two ways. We see it here in this text, right?
That's right.
Some of them were disrupted in a positive way. They said, whoa, wait a minute. Yes. I've been missing some things. Here is the thing I've been missing. And they embraced it. Others, well, they formed a mob. They go and they tell these lies and all this stuff, make up this. And we see a lot of the same things happening to this day, right?
That's right.
The opponents of Christianity are going to push hard. And so that's where this next point we're making is really important, because we need direction for how to take the disruption that's happened and what do we do with it here in real life, in the real world, on the ground.
Certainly
and so that's what we're going to look to now.
Certainly.
But let's turn our attention to the direction for the people that comes with Christianity, with the gospel of Christ. You look at the world and all of the problems that we have in the realm of human-generated problems. It may be a little bold, but I think in principle, we could find a solution to every major issue that human beings are causing. Okay? Just name an issue. Maybe that's a study we ought to do sometime. We'll just take the problems that we face in this world that are caused by human error, moral error is what I'm talking about. And we'll see in the scriptures, either directly or in principle, that God gave an answer of 7 billion or 8 billion, I guess it is now. If all of us were to just say, okay, I'm going to stop the direction I'm going and I'm going to turn in the direction that Jesus the Christ would have me to go, there'd be no murder, there'd be no war, there'd be no sexually transmitted diseases. That would die out. The abuse of children, abuse of elders, husbands and wives mistreating one another, divorce all over the place. On and on we go. The cost of living would come down drastically. I used to work for Walmart when I was a young man, back in some other lifetime. And our price point, the management was clear, 30%. That's 30 cents on every dollar that you spend at Walmart. I'm going to say that's probably pretty close to the same across the board. 30 cents of every dollar is theft recovery. Okay, we're just going to look at a few of these areas where if people would just do what the Lord would have them to do, where it would clear up a lot of these things. But Christianity gives people a direction for real, moral, ethical, upright, holy living in the real world. Now, these Jews that come and they accuse Paul and Jason and the others, they did so, if you'll remember there in verse 7, Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to them, or contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. Now, they acted as if they cared about the decrees of Caesar. These Jews hated Caesar just as much as anybody else might have. But they framed them, these Christians, as being rebellious, upheaval, causing people. They were rabble rousers in their opinion. And what they were bringing to the authorities was that charge, trying to get them put out of commission. But really, at the end of it, it was that last phrase, saying there is another king, Jesus. They knew they weren't fomenting rebellion and sedition and trying to cause a revolution. They just knew that this King Jesus they were bringing was a disruption to their way of things, and they didn't want to let go of it. Now, we have to be on our guard about our attitudes in these things. And so we have to be willing to take the direction that the disruption of Christianity brings. So we're going to look here in three particular areas that this deals with the direction of our lives. The first two of these are that we are to be people who are submissive to the authorities in our lives. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 and 23, here in the practical section of this letter, he's dealt with parents and children, husbands and wives. Here he moves to, at the time, bondservants, okay, and their masters. There were a host of relationships that would fall under this. Some of it was somewhat akin to the chattel slavery that is such a problem in American history, the West African slave trade and all of that. But there were other forms of it too. Debtor's prison, people would get in debt and couldn't pay it, and so they would go and work as a bondservant to pay off their debt. Some of them were taken as prisoners of war. Rather than being put to death, they were put to bond service. And so many things, the very term redemption has its grounding in this idea. There were some who were very philanthropic, and they would come and buy the release of someone who was a bondservant. Somebody had enough money to do it, they would pay the price and get them released. That's the ransom idea that is behind the gospel. So, but the closest parallel for us in our time would be the employer-employee relationship. Now, I can quit my job and I can go try to find work somewhere else, but I'm still bound to my job because I have to support my family. I have to eat, they have to eat, I have to provide for their needs and all of those things. That's all part of my responsibility. So I am really a bond servant to a degree, a little bit of a different relationship. But in Colossians 3:22 and 23, listen to this. Bond servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men. And verse 24 says, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. So if I am a Christian and I'm an employee, I'm going to render the best service that I can. Part of that 30% at Walmart, the biggest portion of that, you might think shoplifting was the issue. That was part of it. But the primary loss was time theft. It was employees that were clocking in, drawing a check, and they were not doing anything. And so productivity was lost. You see that across the board in manufacturing, warehousing, all the way down through the whole chain. So how much difference would that make? This is a direction where to be good employers, because he's going to continue on in Colossians 3 and tell the masters what they were supposed to do. But it would cause us to be good employees. In Romans chapter 13, verse 1 and following, we don't have time to read all of this, but spend some time there. We're to be subject to the governing authorities. Now, someone said, well, wait a minute, I can't. Do you see what's going on with our government? Yes, I do. I'm very aware of it. I've been aware of it for decades now. And yes, we have a lot of problems there. However, the only time that I am to practice civil disobedience, if you will, and not keep the government's directives, the laws of the land, is if they would force me to sin against God. Otherwise, I am supposed to be a submissive citizen in that. Now, this was written during a time when a Roman emperor, if I'm not mistaken, the directives of Romans 13 were during the time of Nero Caesar. He's worse than any president we've ever had. Okay, worse than the one now, worse than the one before, and worse than the next one that's coming up. I would be willing to wager if I were a betting man, which I'm not. Not advocating gambling, but they were to be submissive even to that regime. Okay, so we only push back on the government when it violates God's will. In Acts chapter 5, verse 29 particularly. Peter and the other apostles, when they were being dressed down about this, they said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Okay? And so we, Drew, have to be submissive to the authorities in our lives until they would force us to sin against God. That's tough, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's part of that disruption of the ways of the world too, right?
It is.
I'm an American, man. I'm free. I can do whatever I want to do. No, I can't.
And
especially not if I'm a Christian.
And making that connection with the disruption of the world and the direction that we have as people. I was thinking as you were talking about some of the employee-employer relationship, that sort of thing. In the Bible, you see Joseph, who's in a prison. Well, first he's sold into slavery and he excels in Potiphar's house. Then he's in prison. He excels to being the grand vizier of Egypt.
Right.
And then I thought of Daniel. Daniel is this fellow the Babylonians have just been sacked by the Persians. And next thing you know, Darius still sees the value in appointing him higher. And he does that in the Babylonian court as well. He just keeps going further. And I thought, if you were one of those, let's say that there are 10 employees and you're one good employee out of 9 other bad ones, 10 total. Who do you think they're going to look for as being somebody maybe in management, maybe promoting? He's more responsible. Let's give him a key to the building, that sort of thing. Trustworthy. You're going to excel. Now, what does that do to the other fellows? It sparks envy, jealousy, hatred.
Just like what happened with Daniel.
Just what happened with Daniel. And thinking then about how we as Christians can excel because we're the people we need to be. We may not see it, and it may be difficult at the time where you think it's not right. Everybody else is taking a break at work the whole time while I'm working my tail end off. Well, that's perfectly fine. It has its reward too. And even if it's not in this life, God is saying, and we should do it heartily as unto the Lord, like you read. So take a look at this. This is our third thing. Christianity is a disruption to the world. It gives direction for people. But now number 3, the third thing they declare Christianity to be is the real dominion of the real king. Now, they don't intend it that way. You look back at Acts chapter 17, they say he's purporting a new king other than Caesar. But the interesting thing about this bit is that the Jews were no friends of Caesar either. Why, they too, if they're honest, they too were looking for a Messiah, a king, a new anointed one who would overthrow Rome. It's a large reason why Jesus and his whole movement got off the ground in the first place in the gospel accounts. Well, anyway, here we are in Luke chapter 23. I'm going to look at Luke 23 with you for just a brief moment. The whole body of them got up and brought Jesus Christ before Pilate. This is right before the crucifixion. And in 23:2 of Luke, they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." So this charge in Acts 17 isn't a new one. It's actually an old one. It's revised. It's revisited. And here we are in 23:2. Pilate then asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him and said, and you need to read John 18 sometime and see the answer that Jesus gives in expanded form in John 18, where he says, look, king is not my word. King, as you're using it, that's your word. And you mean something different by king than I mean by king. And so Pilate, not really fully understanding what's going on, he says, explain, more or less. I'm paraphrasing. And Jesus says, here's why I came into the world. I came into the world to be a witness to and of truth. And Jesus Christ says, my whole view of kingship, my whole view of empire, as it were, it's a different view entirely than what you're familiar with, Pilate. And Jesus says, my mission isn't to overthrow Caesar per se, but it is to overthrow Caesar. But it's in an entirely different way. I don't mean to take his crown, you see. Jesus said to Pilate, he said, what I mean to do is take away his sin. I mean to take away his influence. I mean to reorient the whole discussion. And we've all contributed to the damage of the world. That's true about us, not Jesus, of course. And Jesus says, and I'm here to wreck that whole world, turn it upside down. And Pilate, maybe, I'm reading in a bit, but maybe starting to get a little bit of what Jesus is saying. Maybe he starts to see a Jesus a little bit more of like an insane fellow. This guy, he's out of his head. But his wife had seen some things in a dream, and maybe he was a little bit suspicious. And here in Luke chapter 23, upon hearing Jesus answer, it's as you say, 23:3. Pilate says to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt, no fault in this man. And they still call for his crucifixion. You want to submit to the real king. Even Pilate said, no guilt here. His deal is something different. And so, Todd, what have we learned about Christianity in Acts 17? These guys have said a couple of things about Christianity. They don't mean it to be positive,
Right.
But what have we learned about Christianity in their mouths today?
So much. One, we need a disruption. If I'm headed in the ways of the world, I need to be disrupted. The world definitely needs to be disrupted. Our thinking is so off.
Yeah.
You don't have to look very far at all to see the examples of that.
That's right.
Day in and day out. We're seeing real world consequences of that, right? The confusion, the disarray, the hate. We're so divided. And the things that are dividing us, I mean, really, you can't be right thinking and put that back together. Somebody's mind has to change.
Yeah.
Which means then we need real direction, right? And he brings that. But none of it means anything if I will not submit to the dominion of the real king. And I'm mindful of Colossians 1, verse 13, as we close this out, something to think about. To those in Colossae, he said that he, that is the Father, had delivered them from the domain of darkness and conveyed them into the kingdom of the Son of his love. Are you in that kingdom?
Hi there, my name is Bud Moorfield, one of the ministers at the Elizabethan Church of Christ. Now, we hope you've enjoyed the show today. Now, if you have questions pertaining to the subject of today's episode, or you would like to know more about God and His church, or the plan of salvation, you can just head on over to our website at elizabethancoc.org for our contact information and more. It will be a joy to get to know you and discuss the biblical viewpoint.
During Esther 4, verse 14, the Jewish people are in trouble. Mordecai is speaking to Esther, and he says, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" How does this factor into our discussion about the true dominion of the true king today?
Yeah, we were talking about the disruption of people, the world, not just people, but the world in its way. We were talking about the real direction for people. And we were talking about the dominion of the real King Jesus. This has always been the way with God's people. And in Esther 4, the question is raised by Mordecai, who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And the point he's making is you may have something bigger here for God that we've missed, that we've overlooked. You may have a big purpose. And how does that pertain to our viewership today? We've got to think about what our big purpose is. Do we submit to Christ? And what are we doing to influence the world?
Amen.
We have heard the joyful sound.
Thank you for joining us today on Biblical Viewpoints. If you have a question concerning the things taught on this program, desire to enroll in our free home Bible study course, or have some other way we may assist you in your quest to know the truth, you may contact us at Biblical Viewpoints, 137 East C Street, Elizabethton, Tennessee, 37643. In the meantime, we encourage you to find a Church of Christ meeting in your community and worship with them. You will always find a hearty welcome and a group of Christians eager to serve you.